evening, I'm Christopher Schmidt. The median rental price of a two-bedroom apartment in Cambridge today is $2,950, and this is Renters Matter. Tonight on Renters Matter, zoning, or how homeowners made housing expensive for all of us. Now, 6 months ago, if you'd asked me what zoning was, I would say, I don't know. Zoning is not really something that most of us think about as we walk around in our daily lives, but one of the things that I've learned over the past 6 months is that zoning is the thing that keeps housing expensive. Zoning is controlled by the people who already have houses. And zoning is the thing that makes everything that I hate about Cambridge exactly what it is today. So we'll get into that. We'll also be talking a little bit about what we can do about it and how we can fix this going forward. But first, let's explain a little bit about what this is, okay? So zoning is the rules that describe how a city can build. It describes how or what can be built where. It describes what is available. It describes what rules set for what buildings can be created here in Cambridge, or in any town, really. So in the 1920s, there became this concern that there was going to be overbuilding or that, they were going to have houses right next to industrials as we came out of the early industrial era and other things like that. And so in order to prevent houses from being built right next to factories, zoning was introduced. It's a little bit more complicated. I really don't know the history of pre-1920 zoning, but in 1924, zoning was introduced here in Cambridge, the city that we're broadcasting in from today and where I've lived for 14 years as a renter. So zoning set up rules initially around where houses could be and where houses couldn't be. The idea was sort of for protecting the health and safety of residents who lived in a town. And there were only kind of two zones. It was either residential or it was unrestricted. What you'll see if you look around Cambridge is that most of the zones and most of the built environment of Cambridge today really dates back to whatever was locked in place in 1924. Zoning was a tool that over time became used to describe more and more and more aspects of what could be built. So rather than just saying this can be housing or this can be a restaurant or this can be an industrial park or whatever, it became the case that zoning started to control more things than that. And so what you'll see now, if you look at zoning in many cities, is that it controls not just what type of thing can be built, but also how much of it can be built, how high it can be built, and pretty much everything about the built environment. How far do you have to be back from your property lines? How many parking spaces do you need to have? How many different, how many square feet can you have for your lot? How many housing units can you have? Can you have an apartment building on these properties? And over time, these numbers have been turned down and turned down and turned down, such that if you look at the average city today, like Cambridge, that was built largely before zoning existed, what you'll see is that pretty much nothing that exists today in Cambridge can be built. In 2016, there was a study done in Somerville, and what they found is that in total, of all of the properties in Somerville, one of the densest cities in the country, of all the properties in Somerville, there were only probably 22 properties that could be built under the rules that exist today. And that realistically, above those 22, most of them probably couldn't be built anyway because they didn't have enough parking spaces. Now, no one who lives in Cambridge, or very few people who live in Cambridge or Somerville, would say, I really hate my city, and I just really don't want to live in a city that looks like my city. Of course they wouldn't. But that is actually what has happened. What has happened is that people who have the political control in cities have decided that they hate their city so much, they want to make sure that they can never be built again. And this is what you'll actually see, is that if you see new buildings going up in cities, they tend to actually feel very different from the existing buildings because they have to. They're not allowed to build by right or without special permission new buildings that look like the old buildings. In Boston, we have the canonical, in the Boston area, the three-decker, which I always used to call a triple-decker, apparently incorrectly, the three-decker house where you have 3 units that are built up. And these buildings were originally created sort of as a way for low-income people who lived here to build up and build more housing on one lot. You would have your unit and you would get together with two other families or have different family members move in and you would be able to build these 3 units. And again, my history is not great. I'm probably going to say some things that are wrong in this show tonight. And so for all of you who are out there saying, that's not what these were, you're probably right and I'm probably wrong. But approximately a triple-decker unit is where you have 3 different levels. Each level is someone's home. And they go up, and they were a pretty common style of building. There's a fair number of them in Cambridge, these 3-family kind of units that exist around Cambridge. But over time, what was determined is like, well, we don't want those kind of people living here. And those kind of people could mean many different things. In many cases, for example, in Boston, when they initially established some of these rules, what they said was, well, we don't really like having no kitchens are allowed above the 2nd floor for fire safety reasons. You know, we don't want to have any fires. And let's be clear that like wood frame buildings built in 1915 in Boston, when you have many things close together, there are real reasons to be concerned about fires. But it is the case that these rules were created not to prevent fires, but because this was the type of housing that generally low-income immigrants would live in. So it was a way to keep people out. Now, what you'll see today in many areas is that the same thing applies. In many cities across the country, including cities like San Jose or up until recently Minneapolis or other similar places, what you see is that 50% or 80% or 95% of the area in the town is zoned for single-family housing only, meaning that you cannot build a triple-decker, you can't even build a duplex, you can't do anything except build a single-family house. And these rules, which in many cases date back almost 100 years to the early days of zoning, are what, in part, keeps housing expensive. When you look at a piece of property, if you can't build 3 units on it, if you can't build 3 homes on it, then what you are doing is you're forced to pay more for the land that the building sits on in order to have the same amount of house. But it's not just single family versus apartment that matters. There's all kinds of rules that achieve essentially the same thing. One of the rules that applies is that you must have no more than n square feet of space, or for every x square feet of lot. So if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, which is kind of a suburban sized lot in most places, a 10,000 square foot lot in some parts of Cambridge is allowed to build only, and I say only like this is small, but only 5,000 square feet of house. Now, if you're talking about a single-family house, you're like 5,000 square feet of house. Who needs that? Obviously, you're right. But if what you're talking about is building 4 apartments, so for example, a building with 2 doors that you could walk into, and on each side you have 2 levels of apartment, now you're talking about being able to only have a relatively small space for each of those apartments. 1,200 square feet is actually a largish apartment in Cambridge. But you can go beyond that and look and say, okay, well, in addition to these rules, if you look at many of the lots in Cambridge, were divided into 5,000 square feet. Okay, so 5,000 square feet, if you're only allowed to build 2,500 square feet of apartment, and you want to build a triple-decker, well, now your triple-decker is limited to no more than 800 square feet per floor, which is a pretty small place. Not as small as you can get, but a pretty small place. And it's not that that's enough. In fact, there are something along the lines of like 6 or 7 different types of restrictions that you might have that you have to pay attention to when you're talking about zoning. And so this is the zoning kind of guide to Cambridge. You don't have to worry about reading these numbers. They're not that important. But there's all of these different districts listed over here on the left. A1, A2, B, C, etc., O's and B's. So, residential, offices, and business areas that are all have different rules. And those rules set things like what is the minimum size of apartment, of lot that you can develop on? What is the minimum size of lot to add a second unit to your thing? So in some parts of Cambridge, I talked about the fact that if you have a 10,000 square foot lot and you wanted to put a duplex on it, you have to have more than X, whatever, you can't do it. But one of the reasons you can't do it is in order to build a second unit on a lot in an A1 zone, you have to have 12,000 square feet of lot. And there really just aren't a lot of 12,000 square foot lots in Cambridge because many of them were divided up at 5,000 when the city was initially divided up in many parts of town, or they just aren't that big. So these numbers are designed in significant part to make it difficult to add more units to the buildings that we're in. Now, for the most part, you don't notice this when you're walking around Cambridge because most of Cambridge was built before 1924, before zoning was introduced. So if you look at this map, this pink on this map, and I'm sorry for colorblind folks, I really do apologize. The pink on this map is buildings that were built before 1924. The green is areas that were built after 1924. Now you'll look, and it ignores MIT and Harvard because those are mostly institutional. And if you look around, you see that most buildings in Cambridge were built before 1924. Now, why does 1924 matter? Again, 1924 is when zoning was introduced. Now, an additional aspect of this, and one way you can tell that zoning has had such an impact, is that before 1924, buildings were replaced all the time. They were just replaced all the time. You would build a new building, you would tear down an old building, you put up a new building. If you wanted to, add another, apartment to the top of your house, you could do that. Or maybe if you wanted to sell to somebody who wanted to replace it with an apartment building, you could do that. If you look at Cambridge in 1916, which was long after Cambridge's kind of initial population boom, Cambridge built 450 new buildings that are still standing today in 1916. They built 336 buildings that are still standing today in 1920. Now, those were relatively big years, but in the 50 years before zoning was introduced, on average, Cambridge produced 170 new buildings that are still standing today in Cambridge before 1924. Since 1924, since the introduction of zoning, instead of building something along the lines of 100 to 150 new buildings a year, on average, there's only been 33 new buildings a year. And there are many years in which there has been almost nothing built at all, as few as 5 or 6 buildings that have been redeveloped. Now, this lack of redevelopment is a big part of why we run into this housing problem eventually. Now, you might be asking, it's 2019, 80 years of zoning, you're telling me, why didn't we run into a housing crisis before? And that's a fair question. It really is. What has happened to Cambridge's population during that time, and this is pretty common throughout much of the urban areas, is that after World War II, there was a big shift to the suburbs. In some places, this was white flight, or called white flight. It was kind of the fear of certain types of people coming in and ruining the neighborhood or whatever. But realistically, the 1950s established the trend of tract housing and suburban living. It established significant federal subsidy for people moving to the suburbs, and it basically drove a massive reduction in population from the cities. And so what happened is that, Cambridge hit its pre-World War II peak at about 120,000 people. And over the course of the 1970s and 1980s and 1960s, whatever, all the way through, their population was kind of declining. In the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, what we've seen is that population has started climbing again, to the point that now Cambridge is actually back to its pre-war peak population. And while the number of people per household was much higher in the 1950s or 1940s, because you had families with more kids, you had people who would have 5 or 6 kids was not that uncommon, and now Cambridge is a much younger population that has, and overall family size is lower. On average, instead of having an average of like more than 3 people per household, Cambridge is now down to just 2.1 people per household. So we have 120,000 people in Cambridge, but those people are more households. There's more people who want to live alone, who are, grad students, who are, young professionals who don't want to live in a house full of 6 other people. Now, Cambridge, the rent is so expensive that you don't really have a choice oftentimes. You have to live in a house with other people, but many people would like to live in smaller places, in smaller apartments, and that's the thing. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this that homeowners are the ones that have made the rent so high. So the reason the rent is so high, we talked about a little bit last week, is the lack of supply of houses. The reason that the supply of houses is low is that you're not allowed to build anymore. If you look at the residential districts of Cambridge, if you look at just the places where homes usually are, you think about Cambridgeport and West Cambridge and North Cambridge, not the big corridors or anything else like that, but the residential areas of Cambridge, and you look at what you're allowed to build, what you will find is that Cambridge has in allowed under zoning rules, so paying attention to those limits on square feet, limits on lots per unit, and other things like that, is limited to just 29,000 units. Now, the total number of properties currently in Cambridge in those spaces is 39,000. So there are 39,000 homes in a space where legally you're only allowed to build 29,000. And the reason for that is because many places are not allowed to have more. If you see this 49 Whitmore Avenue here, this building is zoned for 1 unit. You can only have 1 unit here, but there's currently 2. If you look at 68 Porter Road, this kind of 3-level house here, it's currently zoned for 1 unit and it has 2. If you look at 20 Crescent Street, we have that classic Dreidecker look. It currently is zoned for 1 unit and it currently has 3. So you're not, none of these places is allowed to have more units. If we look at this random selection from Cambridge, what you'll see is that the total number of units that you have here is like 15 in a place that's only allowed to build 10. Now there is a place here, it's currently zoned for 2 units, the 6 Hillard Street, so you could actually build more there, but realistically most of what you find is that you're already over the limits. You cannot build more housing, and if you cannot build more housing, then you're not going to be able to build housing to meet the needs of the community. Like if you're not allowed, then of course there's not going to be a new housing built. And these rules have been changed over time to be narrower and narrower. Now, there's been a lot of reasons that people have for that. Most people just don't like the idea of their neighborhood changing. They move to the neighborhood, they want it to be the same as it always has been, they don't want it to change. And hey, look, I respect and understand that. I respect and understand that people are like, no, I like my neighborhood just fine. But what that means is that as they've changed the knobs on these and said, well, you have to have more space per unit, or you can only build up to 35 feet, or you must be at least 20 feet back from the front yard, or anything else like that, what you'll find is that 85% of Cambridge's houses can't be built today. And specifically, if you look at apartment buildings, there's 831 apartment buildings with more than 4 units in Cambridge today. Not counting condo buildings, just apartment buildings. 831 buildings. Those 831 buildings, 93% of them could not be built under today's rules. All of them exceed these rules. Now, what is the effect of this, right? So homeowners turned these things down because they had they were voters. They could donate to political candidates. They have the right to oppose new developments because they have a legal right as an abutter to object to anything that breaks the rules. They have the ability to drive the conversation forward and have always tended to be wealthier and have tended to have the political control in Cambridge. If you look at the political donations to candidates in Cambridge, of the top donors to most candidates, 90% of them are homeowners. If you look at the Cambridge City Council, 90% of them are homeowners. If you look at the people in Cambridge, 65% of them are renters, but renters, just realistically speaking, don't tend to have political power. They're younger, they tend to be more transient because when the rent goes up, they have to move, and they just don't have that political power. So homeowners have been able to change the rules to keep their neighborhoods the same by turning the knobs down on what you're allowed to build until you can't build anything. And this is why 85% of Cambridge is illegal today, 91% of Cambridge's apartment buildings are illegal today. So what does this mean besides the rent is too dang high, though? Well, one thing it means is that you're only allowed to build things that look in particular ways. And so one of the things that people oftentimes complain about is that, like, oh, we're only building giant buildings, right? We're only building at the edge of town in these giant buildings. If you look in Cambridge, that can be North Point or Alewife, or it can be the large developments in Kendall Square. So why did these developments go forward, but I can't add a new 3rd level to my house and have someone else live there? Well, the reason for that is basically because they spend the money to convince people that this is a good idea. What happens with these large developments is that they come in and the rules say you can't build more than 7 houses on this property, and the developer comes in and they say, you know what, I think it would be better for the city if I could build more than that. And they say, well, that's the rules, we don't want to do that. And they say, no, here's what's going to happen. We're going to write a zoning petition, and it's going to say that I'm going to create a lot more office space so I can make some money, but I'm also going to build a bunch of housing for you. And I'm going to build you a park. And I'm going to fix your boathouse. And I'm going to make those units affordable, so I'm going to subsidize them so people can live in them, which is a big problem everyone knows. And really this deal's going to work out really well for both of us. We're going to do some horse trading. You're going to be happy. I'm going to be happy. The people of Cambridge are going to be happy. We're going to build a big civic space, all of these things. So these are community benefits packages that are offered by these big developers that basically amount to them giving the city, the residents of the city, not like the city councilors, the residents of the city, something that the city wasn't building. So if you look at them building these big developments in North Point, they're like, okay, well, you're going to add a park, or okay, you're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And the courthouse project that recently passed is 48 units of affordable housing. It's an affordable daycare. It's finding a tenant for a food market and a grocery store and all this other stuff. So what happens is on these big projects, they basically have a $10 million buy-in. They're like, oh, yeah, we're going to build all these cool things. We're going to make some money. You're going to be happy with it. But if you don't have the ability, like when I go develop my house and I want to add one unit on the top, what am I going to do? I'm going to say, oh, yeah, I'm going to pay $10,000 to fix, the street lights or something like that. I can't do that. I don't have the money for that. I'm just trying to add a new place for my, kid to live who just moved back from college, who can't get a job anywhere because the job market sucks for anyone who's under the age of 25 or 35 for the most part. Like, these people who are stuck in these situations, they come back and live at home and they can't even add an apartment for their kid on their house. So large developers come in and, hey, look, they're creating housing, and that to me is great. And they're creating office space, which is we have to be more careful about, I think, because it can increase the price of housing. But building office space in Cambridge is really important for climate reasons because we're transit connected. We want to have people commuting in on transit to get to their jobs. Building more jobs near transit is hugely important for our climate goals. So we have to build some of both. Cambridge is just well connected enough, it would be unreasonable for us not to. But because many of them still have to follow these frameworks and rules that have been put in place over the past 100 years that are tuned to keep people out, they have to do silly things. They have to build in these setbacks. They have to build back to these limits. They can only build things that are 35 feet tall, and if their building is any taller than that, and their setback is based on that. So you look at a lot of buildings in Cambridge now, houses that are built have flat roofs. Why do buildings have flat roofs? Well, for every additional foot of height that you add, you have to add 1/7 of a foot of distance back from your lot line. So if you make a peaked roof, even if there's no livable space in there and you don't run into any other limits, you have to build your house further back from the line because you're trying to prevent shadows on the whatever. If you're looking at why are these buildings, there's a spot near me where 6 condos were built, and they were all built as these little houses rather than like an apartment building where you have one building with 6 units in it. What they did is they had 6 little houses, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Why is that? Well, because if they built them together, touching, attached, like even if they built like a row house, what you would have had to do is, again, in addition to your height, so it's a 25-foot tall building, and it would have been a 50-foot wide building, right? So you got 75 feet. If they had built those all together instead of separating them, then they would have had to build 10 feet back from the line because it's the width and the height of your building added together divided by 7 in this area to do that. Okay, so so the reason you're not building a nice 6-unit building that's like a double wide 3-decker, instead you're building these 6 little condos that do this. It's because of the rules that we've made. Why are buildings set back so far? Why do we have all this wasted space? Why do we have so much parking? Why, when 35% of parking spaces are going unused, do we continue to build more parking directly attached to residential buildings? And I'm not talking about like in Central Square, but I'm just talking about every house that's built, you have to have 1 parking space. Building 1 parking space when land in Cambridge costs as much as it does means that you're adding $35,000 to the price of the house. It means that you're adding $120 to the average price of the rent for every space that you add. Now, in some places further out, you'll see that you don't just have to have 1 parking space for the house, you have to have 1 parking space per bedroom. You'll have limits that say you can't build a house on any lot that's smaller than 25,000 feet. You'll have all types of silly recommendations or requirements, and Cambridge is pretty good Like, not great, and the reality is we're already so dense that the fact that we're pretty good doesn't really matter because you still can't build anything, but pretty good. So what can we do about this? Well, one of the things we can do about this is elect a different city council. So one of the things that is true here is that the Cambridge City Council is not have a lot of direct power on a lot of things. The Cambridge City Council, the city's system, is a council manager system where the manager runs a lot of the day-to-day operations of the city. The council is in charge of legislative and priorities. They can change the ordinances and everything else like that, and they can change the zoning in particular. You could get rid of the rules that say you can't add a house. So on 93% of the properties in Cambridge, you could not build a 4-unit apartment building, and you could change that rule. You could say you can build a triple-decker on any property in the city, and if you did that, you would increase the number of units that could be built in the city, in the residential areas of the city, by half, immediately, with doing nothing else. No begging for money from big developers. You could do that if you elect a better council. Now, it's hard, though, because the rules are, again, designed to protect the people who are already here, homeowners who have a lot of money. You have to have a supermajority in order to change the rules. So in order to change the rules, you have to not just have a majority of people who agree with you, you have to have a supermajority of people who agree with you. And that means you need 6 councilors. So if you want to see more housing built, the thing to do is to find councilors who are interested in building more housing and vote for them in November. They have the power to change zoning with no city manager interference, no anything else. This is the biggest responsibility that they have. They can do that. They could change the zoning to allow you to build more houses. And if we built more houses, then the price of housing would go down. And we don't have to build 20-story tall buildings to do that. If we were to go ahead right now and say you can build a triple-decker on every lot, just that would increase the number of houses that could be built in Cambridge by 15,000. You could add 1/3 to your housing stock across the city without building a single building taller than 35 feet tall. You could do it by dividing existing units. You could do it in all kinds of ways if you got rid of some of these rules. So this is my homework to you, is to go out and look for the pro-housing candidates in the Cambridge City Council election. Because I think if you do that, you'll find that we could improve the fact that the rent is so high. We could get rid of the buildings that are built that aren't in the style of Cambridge because we've made building like Cambridge is illegal. We could get rid of requirements to build parking spaces that nobody used that drive up our rents. We could do all types of things if we elect a supermajority of councilors, 6 councilors to the city council who want to change those things. And that's what I want to do. I'm Chris Schmidt, and this has been Renters Matter.